something I believe pretty strongly about operations in general is you need to be solving the problem at hand. And it's easy enough to solve some of the early stage problems. I think it's also fairly easy to get caught flat-footed when those problems start shifting to ones that require more time, people, financial investment. What I would think about is look for what the hyperscaler strategy is.
Welcome to Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market, the series where hosts Erin and Patrick Riley share the essential stages of the cloud GTM maturity model to start, optimize, and grow your company's revenue through the cloud. They've helped countless ISVs tackle the ins and outs of their cloud GTM motion. And in each episode, they're sharing those success stories from the people who have put them into place. Because ultimately, this way of thinking is the future, and the future is now.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market. I'm co-host Patrick Riley.
I'm co-host Erin Feiger.
And today we sit down with Senior Director of Operations at Commvault, Jacob Bishop. We have a fantastic conversation and an Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market first that you're not going to want to miss. So stay tuned to the end as we unpack his 3 pillars for go-to-market success.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market. I'm Erin Feiger, the VP of Co-Sell at Tackle. Today, we have a fantastic guest, Jacob Bishop, the Senior Director of Operations from Commvault. He's going to take us through his journey from establishing a foundation up to driving adoption today. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Erin. Great to be here.
Awesome to have you here, Jacob. I know we're going to talk through a bunch today. Erin teed us up on the maturity model. Hopefully all of you listening are versed in that. If not, go check it out on tackle.io. Now, Jacob, you're just shy of 5 years here at Commvault, so coming up in a couple months. To kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your roles at Commvault, and then specifically when you were brought into this whole marketplace business? What did that look like, and how has that role morphed into what it is for you today?
Absolutely, Patrick. So I was leading our worldwide deal desk, and I would say we had started getting into the establishing marketplace foundations as a company, but it was very early stages for us. So we'd had a few initial transactions, and it had really been in its own silo. And then as the deals started getting a little bit bigger, right, it started crossing our plate as part of our deal desk business. And that's really where I got involved. And then over the last 4 years or so, I've been very close to almost all the transactions we've done in marketplace, and have transitioned into an operations role where one of my key focuses is how we build our marketplace and co-sell presence and work better with the hyperscalers.
So, Jacob, when you first joined Commvault, they were in establishing the foundation phase of the maturity model and really focused on the marketplace operations. And you spent some time, or you spent some cycles actually kind of getting that going. Once you came on board, what were some of those initial operational challenges that you were faced with? And how did you prioritize them so that you could address them?
Absolutely. So we were present on the marketplaces already. So I missed that initial phase of kind of getting the products and the listings created. We really hadn't done volume yet, and we hadn't done anything that material yet. So as we started seeing bigger transactions, a lot of the first things that came up, and I imagine this is similar for other folks you've seen in that stage, is where you need to figure out how to actually transact a deal, right? You need to be able to have all the supporting documentation. You need to be able to help your finance team get through the revenue. You need to be able to have contracts signed with customers that legal's comfortable with. And you need to be able to do all like the back office functions that support that transaction. You don't need to do them that well at that stage, but you need to at least be able to do them. So I'd say that's really where we started. And there was a period of time that was a lot of putting together, right, manual, what I would consider like an order pack, downloading Excel reports, downloading opportunity links off of Salesforce, putting them together into Word documents, emails flying around between operations, sales, finance, tax, everyone else of, hey, this is everything you could need to know about the deal. And it probably took us, an hour plus just to assemble that, to be able to start processing a transaction.
So identifying those artifacts inside of all, like what it takes to do a transaction.
The amount of companies that have Word docs and Google Docs like that are the tickets to how they're booking deals right now has got to be insane.
Yeah.
I know every customer I talk to starts at that phase.
Yeah, we first got to identify it. Like, what is it? What does it look like? How do you get it? When does it happen? Right?
And really at the beginning, it doesn't have to be perfect. You need to have everything there. How you get it, right, doesn't really matter. Exactly the format doesn't really matter. And when you're in that stage of, 5 deals a quarter, 6 deals a quarter, right, you can do that 5 or 6 times. That obviously breaks as you start to transition into a more material part of the business.
Yeah. And I remember, having a conversation a while back in this kind of earlier phases for Commvault and looking at a goal and helping the organization establish a goal around it. We used kind of the math that all the analysts use and said, okay, can you do 3% of your revenue through the marketplace? Like, what is that number? What is 3%? What is 5%? What is 10%? And we played around with those different benchmarks to try and help you guys establish like a goal. And it was so interesting, like in the room, because you guys were doing some of these transactions here and there, like you said, like a handful here and there. But then to say, let's put a number to that. Do you feel like that number is achievable? And that really all of a sudden kind of grounded, I think, a lot of people in what you guys were putting together and giving it more structure and a goal.
I'm sure we'll get into this more later as well, but that's really one of the key things operationally as you're building marketplace is you do need to be able to track, you need to be able to goal, you need to be able to report back on all of the different work streams that get spun up around marketplace to be able to get the executive buy-in to transition through the maturity model, right? And that was one thing I'm sure those earlier meetings, right? There was some people in that room who were really focused on it, but as that number has picked up and increased, right, the visibility up to executives and the priorities that go around it also get much more prevalent, and the need to be able to continue to report that back only picks up further.
I know we talked about this in a separate discussion, and you've had lots of discussions out in our space around the operational challenges that you talked about and diving much deeper into like how to account for rev rec, what type of tax conversations do I need to have? So I know you've got a solid background and you can help a lot of our customers and other ISVs in that space. But for the sake of today's conversation, I also know that you've got some 3 pillars that you have put together really that help you with Commvault's operational success. Once you've built that strong foundation, can you share with us and everybody listening, like, can you give them an outline of what those 3 pillars are and what they look like from kind of that initial phase?
Absolutely. And the way I think about it, it's really a Venn diagram. So the first pillar is really like administrative excellence. Does my company know how to transact in marketplace? Can we do it effectively? All the internal back office pieces that come with it. And the second pillar is what I really think about as being the go-to-market support excellence. We have sellers out in the field. They need to understand what to do and how. And that Venn diagram piece, there's a whole section in between those two of how do we manage opportunities? How do we quote? How do we kind of go through the lead to cash life cycle in a marketplace motion that most people aren't familiar with? And then the last pillar is what I think about as like partnership excellence. So for the hyperscalers and for the broader channel community, right, this shift in how everyone's doing business has a whole different set of requirements of what you need to be able to explain, how you need to work with your partners in the community. And in that kind of overlap between how you support your own go-to-market and how you support your channel partners and the hyperscalers, there's that whole section of how your field is going to interact with them and enabling and operationalizing all the processes and programs that have to go into that as well.
These 3 pillars, I definitely agree with. Oftentimes we see customers come with 1 or 2, but not all 3. Can you quickly just kind of highlight why are all 3 of them necessary? Like, why can't I just have everything set up and the foundation laid out and then go try and do marketplace or do co-sell without the sales and the go-to-market piece or without the partnership piece? What is the importance of having them together in kind of the Venn diagram if I'm picturing it in my head?
I think it grows as you go through the maturity model as well, right? Because you can enable as well as you want, but if you can't take a transaction through your own processes, it doesn't get you very far. But where we're all trying to get to in this cloud go-to-market space is, at least the three of us would agree, right? This is a future way that companies will drive their go-to-market holistically. And there's so much detail around how partner programs have existed, how sales enablement has worked in the past, and all of that needs to evolve along with the route to market shifting. So once you have that foundation laid, it's great. You say, okay, we can transact in marketplace. Is anyone going to go do it, right? Why would a seller go choose to do that instead of how they're comfortable with doing business traditionally? Why should a channel partner want to work with you in CPPO or MPO instead of working through a distributor or directly? Why should the hyperscaler work with you, and why should they work with you instead of your competitors? That's a channel partner now that used to be more of a technology alliance than anything else for a lot of SaaS providers. Without any one of those, it kind of falls apart.
I can kind of picture this Venn diagram of like, you have to do these operational things. And then sometimes those operational things are enabling the sellers. And then you've got to go enable the sellers on that operational thing. Sometimes you've got stuff coming from the cloud that you have to go operationalize. And then once you do that, it can then impact how you have to go tell the sellers. Sometimes it's just program things coming from the clouds that you then have to go enable the sellers, right? And so I can see how it's all interacting together and ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's heavy operations and then you go enable. Sometimes it's coming from the cloud. Sometimes it's your own operational efficiencies. Sometimes it's ingesting the cloud stuff so that you can operationalize that, but always enabling and kind of keeping that enablement going depending on where that enablement topic is coming from.
These are all really highly multi-threaded organizational structures, right? Separate marketing relationships with the hyperscalers, driving marketing campaigns, need to understand what the co-sell initiatives are. And reps in the field want to understand how co-sell interacts with marketplace. And all of those things are like inextricably wound together. And the only role that I've seen that looks after the whole scope is operations, right? Go to market's out to sell, marketing's out to market, product's out to build product. And it's really up to operations to bridge all those gaps and make this new ecosystem function.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. I created a company 11 years ago around helping people with the operations. I saw that there's this thing, it's tactical and strategic in nature. And if I can operationalize this and take the operations off their plate, it really unlocks and opens up doors for them to be able to do so much more. So it was like, did I want to create a company and help support people's operations? Not necessarily, but I realized that you have to do that and you have to do it really well because it then lays the foundation for you to be able to do so much more. And it can be a very noisy thing if it's not operationalized well. So it's like, bring down the noise over here so that we can spend more time over here doing all these other great things around going to market. Okay, so now that you've laid out the three pillars, I know there is a story to be told here. What was that story that aided you in your transition from establishing these foundations to building broader adoption with Commvault?
So our early stages in the marketplace were very customer driven. We had customers coming to us with a big Mac agreement, a big EDP saying, hey, can we take this deal through marketplace? Right? That's really what forced us to start thinking about this. What really drove the transition was starting to see some of the materiality. And there was a deal we had that was a renewal, multiple years, wanted to go through marketplace, historically through the channel. Right? This was before we had really figured out all of the internal processes, right? It was before we had clear rev rec policy, before we knew how contracting would work, right? None of that work was done yet. And then you're coming down to the last month of the quarter and it's like, okay, there's ballpark of 7 figures that we need to figure out how to take through marketplace to get this deal done. And what does that look like for us? That really drove, for me at least, right? We need to figure out how we're going to do this in the future, right? That's where I kind of think about our establishing foundation having ended and us moving towards building adoption. It wasn't, I would say, like a grand strategy of ours, but the customer demand was there and the volume was presenting itself in a way that I knew operationally we weren't going to be able to meet the demand without figuring out the next steps in the next phase of our maturity.
And during this time, there's just one, two of you doing these activities?
At that point, I was the one doing all the private offers. It was me doing that. We had a few people involved in the order processing side of it. But overall, there was probably 4 or 5 of us who really had a good sense of how marketplace was working.
At this time, obviously, you're starting to see some value. There's starting to become some more consistent activity. You realize you need to do more. At this time, did you start to look at tooling and sales? Like, what was that overlap between the go-to-market pillar and the administrative pillar that really helped push you into, hey, maybe we've got to go figure out how to do co-sell better. And hey, the partner programs, we've got to actually go look at these, take them seriously. And then we've got this whole sales team over here that probably needs a lot of work too. How do we put all those together now? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, like you incubated a lot of this, and now you've taken this incubation and you have to really integrate it into Commvault's systems and tools.
So the scale piece of it becomes very, very systems dependent. And interestingly for us, and this actually differs than something I've heard from others in our space, is it was really marketplace that drove more of our need to figure out both marketplace and co-sell. So marketplace was driving some of these transactions, and that led us to have the conversations of how do we align CRM? How do we align quoting tools? How do we get virtual POs, bookable artifacts? Right, that's where Tackle obviously has come into that discussion pretty significantly. And then marketplace has really driven this broader holistic hyperscaler discussion that's led us to looking to operationalize co-sell as well. In that stage, it was really how do we take our ability to transact and make it something that doesn't need, the hand-holding of just one person, but can actually scale beyond that to where the field can understand it, where you're not having 3 calls with a sales rep to be able to tell them how to do a transaction, right? So it was that first push wasn't to any means to an end state of automation and all the things we're still working on, honestly, but it was to the more repeatability of the manual processes and starting to pick apart how the documentation works together, how some of the key systems work together to be able to do, at this point, not 5 deals a quarter, but maybe it's 15 or 20.
So you incubated the processes, you knew the artifacts. Now that you know those 2 components, using Tackle to say, how do we integrate this into Salesforce? I now know the artifacts that I need to bring in, what they look like, what's the data in them, where that needs to be properly stored in my systems, who needs to see that data, right? So you knew all of that so that when it came time to operationalize it inside of your tools, you knew like where to put that stuff and who needed to see it. Commvault is a big channel-friendly company. You love your channel partners. How did you incorporate your channel partners into this framework to ensure smooth operations and sales support with your channel partners as well?
For us, CPPO with AWS, MPO with Azure, and now Google starting to go into this space as well, has been really key for us to nail that go-to-market support and partnership pillar, right? You're right. We are historically a channel company. I don't really see that changing. The channel is key to our success, but these things aren't mutually exclusive either. Now, while we're on this journey of maturing, our cloud go-to-market, the whole partner community is trying to do the same thing. It's new to them too. How do I do CPPO? What does that mean for my top line and bottom line right now that I'm getting paid by the cloud and it's not the full gross of the deal? And there's been a lot for us where we've actually taken a more proactive role with our channel partners, and we've engaged a lot of them, right? And we've done this now with MPO for Azure rolling out into more countries. We've engaged with channel partners around why they should do this with us and how they're going to do it with us and what does it take to set up and how do I actually transact. And I think for an ISV, if you really want the channel ecosystem to work with marketplace, it's not enough to just kind of sit back and say, well, AWS and Azure are going to go teach the channel what they need to do. No, it's like really, we're the ones selling our product. We need to be out there evangelizing, enabling. There are partners and we want them to do it with us.
How you sell with your channel partners is for you to help figure out how to enable it through this new, vehicle or go-to-market channel.
I would be remiss here too, I think, in all of these conversations. A big thing for us was there's nuance between the hyperscalers with, how you work with partners, kind of all the different steps of a deal are not identical between Azure, between AWS, and between Google. And a big piece for all of this too has been standardizing that conversation internally. So for everyone who's not kind of knee deep in marketplaces day in, day out, it's not, I need to go learn 5 things. It's I'm learning marketplace, and all the back end nuance is kind of shielded.
That's such great advice for those like trying to figure this out. It's like, make it one universal concept for your organization to absorb and have a team working on the back end to help you with all of the uniqueness around each of the clouds. We always say at Tackle, like going to market with the clouds is unique enough that it requires its own set of people, processes, and technology. And there's a whole new data set that comes along with that you now have to ingest into how you are going to market. It's unique enough. It does require its own operational support.
Yeah, Jacob, when you are talking about doing this now today, how are you handling that from yes, the sellers were kind of putting the blinders on, giving them the bare minimum that they need to be successful. But somebody's going and having conversations with the channel. Somebody's enabling them. Somebody's building out these processes. What does that look like? Is that a combination of people on the team? How does that get supported within Commvault? Or what would you say is kind of a best practice in that regard?
There's an overused cliche, right? Enablement is a team sport. And I do think operations has a key role to play in this part of enablement because it is so process driven. There has been, I would say, a fair amount of effort of operations driving out into other parts of the organization to talk about kind of process, what you need to know, what you should understand, what you should be thinking about. But then it's also looking at kind of the internal ecosystem of who are the other roles that are going to need, I would say, the next level of subject matter expertise, right? Alliance teams that are focused on the hyperscalers, PBMs who are working with the channel, right? And however you structure the kind of co-sell effort, right? Those roles also are critical to be able to get at a higher scale than 3 or 4 operations focused roles are going to be able to get to.
I guess because I've been watching the Olympics and they had archery, but I can envision like an archery and you have the bullseye. That's like your core group of people who have to know like all the intricacies. And then each layer out, there's different people, but there's also different information or what level of information that those individuals in the organization really need to know. But everybody in your organization needs to be enabled at some level, some degree, how the company Commvault is going to market with the clouds.
Absolutely. I love an Olympics analogy.
I'll stick with it. So Commvault's well on their way to gold. We've already talked through when you came on board, you're in the establishing foundation, getting training and the prelims, made it to qualifying and building adoption where you all are kind of on the end of today. And now let's talk about driving adoption. Let's talk about getting on the podium. So looking ahead, like what do you see? How do you plan to implement these 3 pillars plus the channel strategy to drive more adoption and growth at Commvault in kind of a driving adoption phase? Is there something on the roadmap today from a people perspective, new processes, new tools you're adopting? What's that look like?
So we're definitely kind of moving along the journey of adopting Tackle better, which is great. But the way I think about getting into that driving adoption phase is really about automation. It's not enough to say, okay, we're going to go from 1 person to 5 people, which is great. You can go from 5 people to 10 people. But at some point, throwing bodies at the challenge, right, just gets harder to manage, gets harder to be accurate. This is a very accuracy-driven business, getting offers into marketplace. So I'd say some of the things that we're thinking about is how do we really get the offer process to feel automated? Think rep discontinuity in an account from turnover. They did their last deal in marketplace. How is that new rep going to come in and pick up how to transact? And Tackle does a lot of this, but there's some pieces too that I'm thinking about internally that are really about how much we want to architect around marketplace, right? Do we record account IDs for accounts? Do we record contacts that purchase in marketplace? And there's a lot of those types of details to really take this from the scale where you can support 5 to 10% of revenue to 50, 60, 70% of revenue in some companies, right? It needs to be embedded in everything that you're doing. Back to that first pillar, there was a whole contracts element of it too, right? We're starting to hear some about, companies looking at adopting marketplace standard contracting. Is that something that we would want to be thinking about in the future? How do we think about change management? I also think is key, because some of the automation steps are easy enough once you do them, but we know that this hasn't been static for the last 5 years. And I don't think we should assume that it'll be static for the next 5 years. So when AWS decides to change something materially with how CPPO works, how are we going to absorb that and cycle that change into all of the processes? I think it's two elements, right? It's automation, tackle's key to that. Internal systems are key to that. And then I would say kind of future proofing and future preparedness for how this is a kind of self-sustaining part of the business.
I so agree. Like, having been around for the last 11 years, helping companies operationalize co-sell, and just from that lens of co-sell and now all things cloud go-to-market, both marketplace and co-sell, one of the first things that we always were challenged with inside of Salesforce, or any CRM system for that matter, is limited amount of fields. It's like you've got all this rich data now from going to market with the clouds that you want to bring in and store that data into your CRM system, but you have limited fields. It takes a long time in some organizations, large organizations like Commvault, to prioritize that work in all of the things that your CRM admins are doing, as well as then having those available fields to even be able to bring in all of this information. So I love the natural evolution of building an app where all of this data now, your marketplace operations, your co-sell operations, all of that data is its own custom object that just attaches and associates to your sales opportunity, so that you can bring all that rich data in. And once that data is in your CRM system, then you can start to harness that data, do lots more reporting, bring more visibility, all the benefits, right, of having that all inside the system. So I love that we're here now in the evolution as a whole in the ecosystem, that we have this data and we can bring it in now to CRM systems in a way that makes it more operationally efficient, provides more automation, and gives us scale, because we can do a lot more with the data in a more scalable way. And I love that Commvault is really investing in all of that.
Absolutely.
So as you've started to integrate inside of Salesforce, like, what are some of those things that have unlocked for you that you didn't have before? Things you didn't even think of that you're like, oh, that's so great, I didn't realize. And I love the fact that we have this now.
I'm really excited about private offer automation. That's going to be a very big one for us. But on the data side, the whole life cycle of the impact of getting kind of all of the marketplace and co-sell data into Salesforce over time, I think becomes a very significant flywheel for how we manage and operationalize that piece of the business. And as visibility grows, right, being able to talk about pipelines for each of the hyperscalers in a given area. If you want an AVP or a sales director to look at their territory, you really need to start being able to put that into not just systems, but kind of think about company forecasting processes. And, how does an ops team supporting an area vice president integrate talking about co-sell and marketplace into their normal cadence of the business? It's a hedge too, to be able to manage the capacity growth that this is all going to drive. There's a limited number of us who are focused on it day in, day out, and being able to systematize really yields being able to shift some of that responsibility and mainstream it into the company.
And I'm sure now that you have some of this data at your fingertips, it helps you drive even more enablement by rolling out some incentives. Has Commvault done anything around incentives and how you have aligned hyperscaler field sellers with ISV sellers to drive co-sell success?
It's something we're thinking about a lot. And there's a piece of it too for our field to understand why the hyperscalers want to go to market with us. It's important to, at a minimum, normalize the incentives. So a deal going through a different route to market and a marketplace deal feel the same for an internal seller, but they need to then understand why the hyperscalers would want to work with them. Why should an Amazon seller think that they should sell our solution versus a competitor in our space? And being able to position to them why our solution helps their compensation is equally important as for our sellers to understand how marketplace drives their own comp plan.
I'm glad you brought that up, Erin, on the incentive piece. We've talked about it's kind of a recurring theme, but I think that fits in well into your three pillars, Jacob, is on that go-to-market piece. We need to make sure that you mentioned it a couple of times earlier, like why do they care? And helping incentivize that obviously helps. And then from an ops perspective, when you talked about making sure that the ops teams were enabled and they had the right tools at their fingertips, like I'm glad you say that. That's where I come from, and having to build those reports and come up with the forecast, that's easier nowadays. There's tons of AI built into most of the tools that I used to use. So I don't have to do VLOOKUPs on 47 spreadsheets anymore. But you still need to make sure that they're enabled and they have some kind of tooling, whether they use Tackle or they're downloading the 12 reports from one of the cloud marketplaces. Like, they still need a tool to put it all together and bring it back to the business. That's definitely key to the process, is just every person in the cycle, in that flywheel, are they all understanding and able to communicate on why and what we're doing in this business? And are we tracking towards success or not? You mentioned these are all things that are kind of key moments in Commvault's story that led us to this driving adoption phase that you all are moving into and starting to lead with scale. You talked early about, hey, customer demand was moving us from establishing foundation. The operational capacity helped move us into building adoption, change management, just basically having a continuity of business, documenting our processes. If somebody else is looking at this, are there any key moments that they should be on the lookout for that you're like, yeah, you should really look out for this? And once you kind of hear or see that you're lacking in continuity of business or operational capacity or whatever it is, then maybe you should start to invest in tooling or people or what have you, and start to move on to that next level of maturity.
Something I believe pretty strongly about operations in general is you need to be solving the problem at hand. And it's easy enough to solve some of the early stage problems. I think it's also fairly easy to get caught flat-footed when those problems start shifting to ones that require more time, people, financial investment. What I would think about is look for what the hyperscaler strategy is. If how we talk about the cloud providers is starting to be centered around marketplace and go to market, right? I think that's a very strong indication that this is the direction you're going to go. And I do think those conversations begin before the need to be able to operationally support everything that's on the long list we've talked about. But I don't think you want to get ahead of yourself.
Yeah. And I can see your three pillars, how that is like your framework for every year. The clouds have different priorities, or they refresh and I give you a new version of their priorities. So as you're ingesting the new information from the clouds, you have this framework that you're like, okay, what is the why? Why is that important from the clouds? What is that new information from the clouds? How does that integrate into our operations? And then how do we then go enable our field sellers on what that topic is and how they need to then do that inside of our organization using Tackle's platform inside of Salesforce? I can totally see new topic comes in and you just kind of, okay, cloud operations enablement, and you just kind of keep going with that, your own little flywheel inside of Commvault.
And it's true across all three of the pillars, right? We're equally liable to have change in their go-to-market priorities, change in how they evaluate partnerships, change in how they expect marketplace to function administratively. All three of those, you need that high level of preparedness, that operations to enablement of the right people at the right time with the right information.
This has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed talking about kind of some of that historical background on Commvault, like where you were, because you've been there for so long and you've kind of seen that journey. I love talking to folks about that overall journey from where you started to where you are now and getting, up on that podium of success. Just to recap, we've talked a lot about the importance of administrative excellence, your go-to-market support excellence, and your partnership excellence. We also discussed the practical advices and the real-world examples on building and driving adoption. If you came across someone in an elevator who was just starting out in this journey, what one elevator pitch, you have 30 seconds, what advice would you give that person?
I think the first piece of advice I would give them is to think about cloud go-to-market as if you're pitching to investors. For most companies, unless you were born in the cloud and this is all you do, this is going to drive change, and it's going to drive change that will be uncomfortable at times. So think about how you position it and how you're kind of able to explain the ROI of why this is something people outside of the cloud go-to-market function should be focused on. And then I would say, think about what are the key actions just to move you to the next step along the journey. Have your roadmap, have your 5-year plan. That's all great. But what are the 3 or 4 things that you're going to solve this quarter that will let you transact 10 deals next quarter instead of 5? Or will build you $500,000 of pipeline, not $100,000. As you go each incremental step along the way, I do think those 3 pillars all will come out over time, but I don't think you need to look at that and say, I'm going to accomplish all of this in the next 6 months, because I don't think it can go out of sequence. And I think the ability to do some of the later stages of it is really requisite on driving early success. So find your early success, and then one step at a time, build yourself to where you have a machine that can run.
You and I have talked a bunch of times, and I had the pleasure of seeing you and the rest of the Commvault leadership team talk at your QBR on how you're going to go forward. What are the things you're doing? How does that fit within your kind of pillars? And to me, I feel like you're a very large enterprise from like an optics perspective of how you run and how you're set up, but you're focusing on your marketplace business in a much more nimble manner, more like a startup where sure, you might not have all the people that are driving all these activities, but you're asking the right questions. You're laying it out in a framework that makes sense to kind of laterally go through. Hey, I need to support my customer first. This is what they're asking for. How do I go deliver that? And that customer needs to go through my partner because I rely on my partners. So how do we implement that in the process? And focusing on the operational aspects so that when you go to your sales team, when you go to your partners, when you go to your customers, it's a much easier process for them to figure out. And they're not waiting for you or hearing you tell them, oh, I got to go make this change and we got to go change this process. So like, kudos to you and the rest of the Commvault organization for leading it in that same manner. And I think there's a lot people can take away from your pillars and from this example on how to run an effective marketplace business within their organization.
Thank you both.
I love having the extra artifact to help people. So thank you for sharing.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market. I know our guest, Jacob Bishop, Senior Director of Operations at Commvault. He's starting to really help out a lot of other organizations out there, not competitors, so don't be getting any ideas. Reach out to him on LinkedIn if you've got any questions. I know Jacob's more than happy to help out.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Erin. Always a pleasure.
Some of the things he said triggered previous episodes and conversations that we've had with our other guests on Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market, especially when he talked about in the beginning, they were operationalizing things, and then it was really the customers were driving the demand to really continue to build out their operations. And that reminded me of Brittany's conversation around you start with either a product-led go-to-market strategy or a customer-led go-to-market strategy. And Commvault is very similar in size as to a VMware and a Veritas and those folks. And so when he said, it was a customer-led, it just really triggered that conversation we had with Brittany.
Yeah, absolutely. And his pillars are very, very useful to put it into that context. Those takeaways that we had with the other guests, obviously this is a theme. I don't think it's a huge shock to people that like all these successful companies have similar themes, but it's neat to lay them out and put them together and see like, okay, from an operational lens, all those things that matter to those people also matter to them. And they just look a little different. Here's how you think about it. So yeah, that was great.
It was nice that we had an operations person on and how he thinks about you have to ingest information from either the company or the cloud provider or the channel partner. And then what do we do with that information? How does it impact our operations? How do we integrate it into our operations? How does it help us evolve our operations? Then how do we then go teach folks about that, both the programmatic side of it and the operation side of it? And he just constantly uses that framework along with his mindset of, yes, have a 3-5 year plan, but really let's break it out quarter by quarter. What can I do? A handful of things this quarter that's going to help me really set me up for success for the next quarter to be able to do more or do something more efficiently or whatever that thing is. I really loved his mindset of quarterly objectives, focus on just a few things. It will really help you unlock the next thing, but have always that overarching 1-3-5 year plan.
I'm excited to follow Commvault through this journey because, you and I both know some stuff that you didn't talk about on how they're looking at product and they're looking ahead. Everything they're doing is looking ahead, like continuity of business and keeping in mind that everything's changing. CPPO is changing, MPO is changing.
The other thing that he said that reminded me of our conversation with Mike Musselman over at Astronomer and formerly Lacework was his advice on you have to be able to pitch like you're pitching to investors. And that reminded me of Michael Musselman's comment about the similar characteristics in the Cloud Alliance team of an entrepreneur. Like, we are building a business inside a business. And like, how are you going to go pitch this inside your company to continue to get stakeholders, to continue to get investment, to continue to prove out the ROI? That really just was like, yep, entrepreneurial, you got to be able to pitch.
Yeah, no doubt. Great conversation. Jacob Bishop, again, Senior Director at Commvault. I love the conversation. I keep staring at his text. He texts me that diagram. You'll all see it here on your thing. But like, I keep staring at it. I'm like, this is exciting.
I think he also needs that bullseye diagram along with his little Venn diagram.
Yeah, we need a couple more rings.
Let's wrap it up. That was a really great conversation. I'm really looking forward to our next episode of Unlock Cloud Go-to-Market.
I'm co-host Patrick Riley.
I'm co-host Erin Feiger. Thank you so much for joining us and stay tuned for next week's episode.